All right, I'm going to kick off. So we have more time for talking because I love this. I love this format. I love that it's casual. I consider you all peers, and so hearing your feedback and perspective and questions on all this material, I think of events like this as being in the lab with everybody, right? Throwing ideas around, throwing around experiences and learning, and I highly value it. So I'm going to jump in. And first of all, what I want to talk about is setting the stage, right, for this experience report. So I've been working with a number of clients over the past year now in an expanded capacity because once we run through flow engineering, we map the flow of work in organizations. The next question is always, what do we do next? How do we grow this momentum? How do we capitalize on what we've learned? And we look around the organization, there's lots of opportunity to improve flow. There's lots of opportunity to improve performance. So I've been working at larger and larger scales, really exciting, sometimes scary, but I've tried to build up a methodology for this that brings everybody along with me, allows me to really understand how the flow of the organization works and should work, where it falls apart, where we see challenges, and then trying to design something that scales, is inclusive of everybody's perspectives, all the experience that's in the organization, all the capabilities that come to bear, and the real purpose that the organization is trying to fulfill. So pulled all this into this most recent example, and I'll walk you through it. So this client was a physical and digital retailer. So they have physical stores, they have an online presence, they're pursuing e-commerce and physical goods. They've been around for a long time. They have a lot of legacy in all the best ways and all the worst ways, right? Um, the initial scope for this was e-commerce. So brought in to map the flow of work in e-commerce across all their teams and understand where the highest leverage improvements could be. And now we're at a point where that's worked extremely well. We've proven out a model that works at that scale, and we're building it out across all of IT. So from 100 contributors to 1,000 contributors. And this organization is 20,000 people total. So eventually, this type of alignment has to happen at massive scale across multiple geographic regions, many different divisions and capabilities. There's a bit of everything in this scenario. And ultimately, I was brought in to kind of help lay the groundwork for this major leadership need to get things done faster, more predictably, with higher throughput, faster learning, faster feedback, and getting out of the weeds and the mud and the friction and the delays that were present in this delivery performance. And I'll share with you some metrics that really drive that home. And to really make an impact there, there's not really any cosmetic changes that you can make. You really have to think about how do you reorganize around the highest priorities to the organization in channels, value streams, flows, teams that are optimized for flow, fast throughput, fast learning, adaptable, agile. And so, first of all, what we have to do is develop a model that can apply to as much of that organization as possible, prove it out that we're connecting all the dots. We're not leaving anybody out in the cold, that we have something that aligns all these capabilities, brings them all together, connects them to what really matters most to the organization, and then deploy an operating model that we can easily socialize, that's going to resonate with people, and ultimately not hit the antibodies in the organization that don't want to change, especially for something where the devil they know, the thing that they've been doing, the status quo is comfortable, right? it's not performing. It's ultimately a disaster for productivity. But we don't know what we don't know. We don't know how this new operating model is going to function. And we can't really iterate on these things. We have to design something that will really tackle the problem wholesale, right? Piecemeal changes don't change the organization fast enough, and they will crumble against all the antibodies in the organization, all the status quo, all the urgent demands, everything that has to happen. So, where's our starting part? Our starting point is understanding the current state flow. And this started very small scale, single team, single value stream, mapping the flow of work, and scaled from there. So, in case you're unfamiliar with flow engineering, the approach that we took was this 5 maps to go from a clear target outcome all the way to a roadmap that lays out what we're going to do to change to improve across multiple time horizons, how we're going to measure that change, the progress and the results, and then who's going to own those changes. To again connect all those dots. This is at a micro scale, at a single team, but we're able to replicate that pattern many times and scale it up. So we initially identify value. We want to understand, what are we trying to do? If we had to ignore everything else, what would we focus on? What is the most critical thing for this organization to accomplish? And then we understand the current flow, the current state value stream. We map it, we measure it. We understand the dependencies that are having an impact on the performance of that value stream. We look at designing a future state flow. So, what will mitigate the challenges that we're seeing? What is going to make an impact on the metrics that we want to move in a specific direction? And then again, laying out that roadmap that makes it very clear who's going to do what it's going to look like, how we're going to measure it, just to establish clarity and bring people along, right? I think the worst thing that you can do with changing an operating model is to just throw it on people, right? Or force them to fit into a structure that doesn't take them into consideration. So this is very much bottom up, but top down, directed and guided. So how do we do this? We map it out. We were primarily using Miro for this. We did lots of maps. Sometimes we had a gigantic map that was divided up into many different sections so everybody could see everything. Other times we're working on submaps that got pulled into master maps where we could see a more global view. This really evolved over time, but we kept sort of expanding and distilling, and I think that pattern works really well. Coming to the value stream, so this is an example of one of the teams. We knew that there wasn't a lot of opportunity in these teams that were operating fairly well with Scrum and sprints, and we had some initial context that the issues were upstream, that there were upstream delays and challenges before these teams even got a hold of the work. There was months and months of time spent. And so this kind of showed up in each of these mapping sessions. We talked to these teams and hearing that there's upfront planning, project management that wants like high fidelity estimation many, many, many months in advance. And so obviously, how quickly we're running these 2-week sprints or how effectively we're running 2-week sprints is kind of the second level concern there, right? Our noses say, start sniffing upstream. So we looked at some metrics. Turns out the lead time for their mean epic, so basically the majority epic, 624 days to get a sizable initiative out the door. This seems like a crazy number, but I wouldn't be surprised if this was more common than you may imagine. If you were to measure from, hey, we want to do this, to the point where it's actually deployed, people are using it, we actually know that change was valuable, it's measured, it's managed, it's instrumented, all of that. These are very challenging things to pull together. And it's so this wasn't shocking to me. I've seen this more than once, but I think it was very shocking to them to see the actual data, because nobody was looking at the data. I mean, I wouldn't want to look at the data if I was in that position, but maybe it was that. Maybe it was just that nobody was taking the time to step back and say, hey, how's this actually going? Right? It's just generally everyone was feeling like it wasn't working. So what do? We start looking upstream. We look at the intake process. We look at everything that it took to get these things rolling, to get them prepared. We heard from the teams that they were given very detailed solution requirements instead of problems to solve. That's a big issue, right? You're investing a lot of time in telling people what to do when they're the experts. We had a lot of smells like this, right? So a lot of things to look into. And all of that takes time, right? When you're developing solutions to hand to people, when they could do it faster and better than you could, and you could distribute that work, that time is time that's lost, right? It's extremely expensive. What happens is you're pulling people into these meetings to make these estimations, to build out these requirements with you. It's incredibly distracting and disruptive. So a lot of symptoms here. But what we also have to do while we're pursuing this is we have to start teaching people about flow, right? I mean, it seems natural. It seems like something that's obvious. We want flow, but how you get it and how you build it into an operating system of an organization is somewhat nuanced, right? There's a lot of detail there. What are the most important aspects to focus on? Where do you start? How do you build up a foundation for folks so that they feel empowered to talk about it and to do their own learning and to apply it to their context? I think this is really, really, new territory for a lot of people. And I think it's new to Agile and DevOps and Lean as well. We don't really have a lot of really clear, simple guidance for these things. And so we took a lot of time to kind of build that baseline of understanding and bring people along in a way that didn't make them feel stupid, and hopefully makes them feel like they're learning something that's a valuable skill that is beyond this transformation effort, right? Something that they can actually use to make better decisions and develop their own expertise, develop a model of understanding for work that they can leverage into the future. This is what flow has brought me, and that's what we were aiming to bring to the rest of the contributors. So we also built this out at much larger scale. So we started, well, I went into the lab and tried to develop a lot of different maps to try to take my understanding of how all these dots are connected together, validate my understanding with people, and then present them something that they could recognize and say, okay, I can see where I am. I can see where, all these areas that are in my sphere are located, where we're going, how we might be able to manipulate this system and design it for better flow. So spend a lot of time trying to create representations that resonate with people, because I don't think we have very clear, obvious ways, and I haven't arrived at any yet, but I'm going to show you what I've been developing. And then we have to make this scalable, right? So we know that this is just a piece of a large organization. We have to connect to that larger organization. We have to bring those people in. We need to get buy-in from everybody outside who's going to give us space, grace to experiment, time to make changes, time to get off the hamster wheel of being busy but not really accomplishing anything, and start moving towards a more sustainable organization. So what are the things that we outlined as major challenges? So there's tons of stuff, right? Probably hundreds if I was looking at every item, every undesirable effect that people had surfaced. But primarily, we have teams that are constantly distracted, juggling a lot of stuff. We have teams that are reactive. They're just order takers for this intake process that is essentially dictating what needs to be done. There was a extreme cost and delay associated with this upstream intake process. And then we had all this gridlock because it it was a functionally organized organization. So there's a lot of folks who are doing, serving many different customers, internal stakeholders, other teams, many different external customers, without clarity on who's first, how to break ties, how to make effective decisions and trade-offs and compromises, and discuss them effectively. So there's a lot of gridlock from just dependencies, unproductive dependencies. So first of all, what do we have to do is really simplify the understanding of what is this organization for, and what do we pick as most important, right? We're going to have to compromise on some things. We're going to have to make decisions about how to optimize performance. So first things first was we reached to the larger organization to try to find values, principles, mission, strategy that we could anchor on and say, don't take our word for it. We're doing this in service of the larger goal of the organization. So this, like many organizations, talks about customer first. They really do believe it. They really do have a lot of investment behind that. The dots were just not connected. It was just not clear how that was happening. So we just returned to the customer centricity and kind of redefined what does that mean for an e-commerce organization, an IT organization, and a business that all has to connect together. So we really tried to kind of rebuild that understanding from ground up using first principles and values that were really powerful in the organization, using the organization's own mythology and culture and beliefs to say that we're not inventing anything. We're just helping fulfill this promise that you've made that is not being delivered on. And then we had these teams' own capabilities, but connecting them directly to those customer needs. So what are the capabilities that deliver on the customer needs that are not being fulfilled, right? I mean, some of them are to some extent, but many of them aren't. And then how do we break this dependency on this very large, complicated, and disruptive intake process by making those teams more autonomous, not calling them autonomous, but making them autonomous by removing all the tight coupling that ties them to other teams and ties them to this dependency of being given everything that needs to be done. And then in order to support that loosening of dependencies, making self-service like a baseline operating principle. So creating self-service wherever possible, removing the need to have tight collaboration, tight dependency, and really putting that self-service in the context of customer needs, right? What do you do when you enable self-service? You're allowing your customer to be empowered to help themselves. You're helping your customer by allowing them to move at their speed, right? And make as many demands as you're accommodating at any time. So how do we start building this out in real terms? So we looked at this representation of the value stream, very abstract, but in real terms, connecting that to the team topologies of the dependencies that are fulfilling those needs, right? Supporting each of those activities to create integrity, right? So to say nothing is just floating around, the dependencies are actually being fulfilled via self-service, via effective collaboration rather than necessary tight dependency collaboration, and showing that we have this kind of systematic integrity across the flow of work, but then also putting that into the context of customers and customer value. So what are these streams delivering? This is a very simplified representation of something that we built out, but we built out a language and a model that these teams could take on and they could build it out themselves. So we're not dictating how you're going to do work or how you're going to fulfill your customer needs. we use this language and they could do it. They could take this on and represent this is how we're going to accomplish our goals, tying it directly to customer needs and specific customers. So putting all that in focus, I think was really, really powerful. So another thing to really put this in a global context is we need to be able to represent this model and the organization at various scales, right? So if we think macro to micro, at the macro level, I think at the value stream network, a bunch of flows of activity, multiple teams involved in a singular delivery of value, let's say. It could be multiple products, but highly aligned and driven to own a specific domain of customer needs. And then being able to map that directly to teams and their interaction modes, so types of teams, how they're interacting, how we expect them to fulfill each other's needs, treat themselves and others as customers. So this idea of customer all the way through the organization really helped tie this together in a way that, you know, at any time you could ask, what does my customer want? What helps fulfill my customer's needs? And in some cases, you're thinking of your colleagues as customers, right? Because they are building upon a platform that you develop, that you maintain. They're using libraries that you produce. So we could use the same principles to really tie all this together and create that integrity, right? That coherence of, very aligned, very comprehensive messaging where folks don't get lost in all the details because they can return back to, oh yeah, it's like this is customer focused and this is how it's customer focused. And then below this team and stream level, we're talking about capabilities. A lot of people are familiar with Wardley mapping. I think really putting those capabilities and the value chain in the context of teams and in the value stream network, I think this is a developing space, but I think it's very important to be able to speak these different languages at different levels so that if I'm in a conversation with an architect, I can put this in their context. If I'm in a conversation with the business, I can put this in their context. If I'm talking to a middle manager, I know what resolution that I need to illustrate, right? I can go right to the team topologies and we don't get lost in the weeds, but they feel heard and understood because I'm speaking their language. And so this is not trivial. It's taken me a long time to kind of be able to zoom out and zoom in this way. I think we have a long way to go to try and make that accessible to a lot of people who don't, like me, spend all their time trying to do this. But this has been very helpful to me because I could say, you know, let me step into the macro space and illustrate something for you. And then I'm going to zoom in on this specific point and let's look at the teams that are involved in this value stream. So that was really, really helpful. And, you know, the goal again is to make people feel like they're being brought along instead of like having change inflicted on them. So then, you know, behind the scenes, there's a lot of mess, right? So I went from customer journey to user needs mapping to blends of Wardley and value stream network. And I had to do this to connect the dots in my head and to really test the integrity of this model. But then I could simplify this, right? I could distill it, boil it down, and bring it to the organization. And we had lots of this really messy development. This is one section of Q&A where we were going through each role. What are the implications for this role, this role, this role? And being patient with folks who have these questions about my piece of this, you know, this specific problem that I need to get addressed. Being able to map that and put that into context was really helpful as well. But there's nothing really simple and clear behind the scenes of this. There's a lot of developing high detail and then distilling down into something that is presentable to different audiences, and always trying to consider, you know, when I was talking to a C-level executive, it's very different representations than when I'm talking to an architect. So we had many different representations. One of these, you know, that really resonated well with folks we're talking about self-service, we're talking about customers, we're talking about removing dependencies. So we use this model of a vending machine, right? Not a perfect model, but being able to talk to people about how are you stocking that vending machine and allowing people to just come up and grab what they want, um, was very helpful. Like helped to kind of illustrate this idea of removing necessary collaboration and low value collaboration and being disrupted, right? Being interrupted by asks, which were constantly plaguing everybody in the environment. So, other ways that we represented this: customer all the way down, multiple layers of different streams made up of multiple teams at various levels, right? So, we're doing everything from representing. One of the things that I found really valuable and helpful was this idea of decoupling common services from specific customers, because customers in their environment are paramount. They really want a highly tailored, customized experience for customers and avoid massive if then else statements for all these different customer and business logic concerns. So creating experience streams where you're responsible for this specific customer's experience, and having that leverage all these common services was really powerful and really helpful, and kind of echoes the way that you would see creating your own application on an open marketplace, right? Pulling from best of breed services where you could say, I want to use this API from this supplier because they're the best. I want to use this from here. I'm going to stitch it together for my customer. That's the kind of experience that we wanted. And this loose coupling, right, across all of these. So we had everything from these 3 layers from top to bottom to complicated subsystems and enabling teams. And this started to really bring folks into a sense of empowerment, right? Clarity that we could all speak the same language. We could talk about the current state, but also the future state and be on the same page. We could step in and out of, okay, I want to talk macro for a second. Let me dig deep into the weeds, but I'm going to step out in a moment. But I want to talk about this one specific thing. And so I found often when you're having these conversations, people can be talking right past each other because they're not talking about the same time horizon. They're not talking about the same scope. They're not talking about the same level of detail. So I think it's really powerful to have language where folks can say, let me zoom out for a second, and have that be not jargony language or, a specific buzzwords, but tools that we can use to actually reframe the conversation and bring people along. So this increased sense of confidence was very clear very early on. We were having much better conversations once folks really landed on this common set of visualizations, because everybody could walk up to the board. I'm going to draw, like, let me draw the network map for a second, and I'm going to talk about this one specific place. Or let me talk about this team dependency. And so we would jump into team topologies. That was really helpful. And then this common language and model really allowed us to have better conversations with different groups, knowing that they speak different languages, right? The C-level executives do not speak domain specifics. They do not speak about dependencies the same way. So understanding that we have to tailor messaging for the audience and understand what resonates with them. First, understand value, right? Like clarify, what are you trying to get out of this conversation? Every conversation, right? Every time we have a meeting, what are we trying to get out of this? What is value for the folks who we're trying to bring along? And then I think that another important piece of this was being able to measure performance. So we took that baseline, we understood our basic flow metrics, we understood the performance of the system in its current state, so we could start to celebrate success, right? And that helped lay the groundwork for this larger scale buy-in, right? Once the organization started to see that investment was paying off, that the model was driving results, even in the very, very short term. Like in some cases, we were walking into conversations and there was a current process that was months. And in an hour, we agreed to chop 90% of it because we're able to say, okay, because of what you want, this, and this, if I can get it to you in a month, does that work? Yes, great. That's the process tomorrow. That's what we're doing. So this language and being able to meet people where they are and thinking of everyone as a customer, I think was really helpful for that. And a lot of humility, I think, to walk into this different spaces. These people own these areas of the organization. They have tons of experience. They might not be looking at it through the lens that they need to, but I think it's very important to respect that they have a lot more knowledge and understanding than you do. So it's very important to check, validate, approach this with a lot of humility. That goes a long way, I think. So what are we doing now? We're expanding this to all of IT, so 1,000 contributors, give or take, over the next 3 months. We are running water through the pipes more and more. So we're running current initiatives through the new processes, the new flows, the new team structures and ownership and dynamics. We are measuring as we go so that we can not only learn, but we can also celebrate those successes, keep people motivated, show that this is working and that they're not invested for no reason, that this is actually driving the outcomes that everybody wants. And then celebrating, when people are contributing and things are working, it's important to step back and recognize that. So that's a major piece of this. And I think that's a major piece of the flow roadmap, being able to say that, you stepped up and you took ownership over this thing. You picked measurements that you reported on, that you were accountable for, and you reported on those measurements and they're moving in the right direction. Like, that's powerful to say that stepping up and taking ownership actually has benefits, as much as it could be scary or as much as it could be putting yourself on the line for results, that there are clear benefits to doing that. And that, exemplification of leadership was really powerful because we walked into a very, I would say, unempowered leadership environment, where there wasn't a lot of valuable feedback loops, not a lot of integrity between say and do, not a lot of credibility, especially between the business and the technology areas of the organization. So all this has been moving in the right direction. And if folks are interested, I'll come back and I'll tell you about how things are going. But this is really building upon the basics of flow engineering, the 5 maps that you can follow, whether you grab them from the book or grab them online, wherever you find them, and really just scaling it up, scaling up those principles of value, clarity, and flow, to try to have maximum impact, but also, I think just meet the needs of these organizations that are really starving for clarity, a sense of alignment, and progress, right? Like a sense that things are happening and that they can get things done, right? In a lot of these organizations that struggle with bureaucracy and inertia, you can forget that you can do powerful things, that you can do meaningful things, that you can do impactful things, sometimes startlingly quickly, if you can line things up, if you can bring people along, and if you can show them a way that isn't too complicated, where they can see themselves represented and they feel heard and included and part of the solution. So it's been incredibly rewarding. It's been incredibly rewarding to hear your stories about implementing flow engineering in different environments. So I would love to hear from you if you are interested, if you're working in this space, if you've been through any kind of reorg over the past year. I'd love to hear about your experience, what you've learned. I would love to, share notes as we go, because I think that communities like this are incredibly powerful, incredibly valuable for us developing a shared sense of what good looks like and what tools to use in specific situations and how to do these powerful things that we know are possible but sometimes seem out of reach. So thanks for the time. I really appreciate being here and being able to close out the event. I hope we have time for questions, but thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Steve. This is awesome. And I think we need more stuff like this. And this is again why I wanted to organize this conference and like, especially like stories like this that you can see. So this really, again, I've loved all the conversations today and with examples. So let's open it up. Who's got? I got a few questions, but again, I'll hold mine just to make sure. Let's see if anybody else has any questions for you, Steve.
I have a question. Maybe it's obvious. Steve, apart from taking people along, was there any other aspect of change management that was painful with taking people along? Where did you encounter issues, or maybe possibly still are encountering issues?
This is a great question. I think that this is, where the rubber meets the road is trying to propose a change that is unfamiliar to a lot of folks. There's a lot of investment historically and professionally in functions, right? Functional organizations where there's a project management, then there's testing, and there's infrastructure, and we might have some cross-functional teams, but we still have massive separation between things that other people do and things that we do. And you can't solve that by just having a 50-person team that represents every single function in the organization dedicated towards each customer need, right? So you've got to draw boundaries very aggressively. And in a lot of cases, we were illustrating a model where it's very new. Like Flow at this, I think, position in the vanguard where we have small teams loosely coupled responsible for very specific domain ownership and customer outcomes is not common. I don't think this is very common in your let's say typical enterprise. And so really reassuring people that we shouldn't just do what we've always done and have a project that everybody gets pulled into, and we balance it against all the other projects and make sure that we have resources available and estimates for everything. When that's the way that you've always done it, it's very hard, I think, to propose a structure where you're saying, we're going to empower these teams that are expert problem solvers to actually solve problems and not be given solutions to implement. That's, may seem obvious to us, those of us in the room, but I think there is a degree of trust necessary in that is uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to me to say that you really can just give people problems and count on them to solve it, right? I don't know, I haven't found an equation that proves that is obvious and that will work exceptionally well, or at least better than giving people solutions or taking forever to develop something that you can hand people. But I find that mental shift, the mindset shift, the model shift towards flow and empowering people to solve problems rather than implement solutions was uh, tough to convince some leadership of.
Yeah, I can relate completely. And you said before something remind me of Bob Gallen, and that is always assume and think and act as if your customer knows everything about their expertise. They are the experts in what they do. So the people feel very disconnected and, thrown aside if we just stuff them with solutions instead of asking them to work together and to give us their expertise. So I think it's the only thing that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Krishna, I see a hand. But you're muted.
Or double muted.
Okay, double muted. So actually, following up on just what you just said. So in that group of 100 people that you first did, were you able to solve the intake problem, which is kind of the letting the people on the front end kind of delegate problem solving down to that group of 100?
It's developing still,
Okay.
but we had some early success. We kind of been chipping away at it. Like I think part of it is it's not something folks feel comfortable with, like a cutover, right?
Yeah.
The same way that you kind of want a strangler pattern for, I think, almost everything, right? If you can get it, and if you can stand to strangle something rather than do a cutover. And what I mean by that is like a shift, you know what I mean, but for everyone else, a shift from A to B, it can be pretty daunting for folks. So, basically making A irrelevant by gradually making B superior and proving its superiority is kind of the model that I prefer. So it's, we had the model, but we kind of tried to gauge and push, but basically say, looking at the things that we thought would have the most impact, start with that, right? Highest impact, highest feasibility. Start with that, show that works, show that we're heading in the right direction and that we can be trusted to change more, was really powerful. But yeah, essentially, we went through a lot of iterations about, they had just redesigned their intake process. They had just redesigned this entire runway. And so there was the sunk cost fallacy. We spent a year developing this, and you're going to throw it away. And so, there was a lot of resistance there, but essentially, by breaking down the model into what is the criteria that needs to be satisfied, right? To get to this point, to get to this point, to get ultimately all the way to delivering something to teams, handing them the requirements, what needs to be satisfied, and then just checking those boxes one after another. And sometimes we could do one thing that checked 5 boxes at the same time. Those are great days. But really kind of starting from highest impact, highest feasibility, and going through. And then I think being gracious about the things that we were allowed to change bought us a lot of goodwill.
Did you find like a couple of teams initially who were willing participants on both sides? Was that important, or did this just kind of develop organically?
Well, I mean, we had a lot. I think you always have a lot of willing participants, right? Everybody wants change. Nobody wants to change, right? Yeah. So it's interesting how you have to kind of thread that needle to say, this is what you want, and it's worth the price, because it's always kind of a compromise between extending yourself to be part of the change, not having everybody else change around you and just make your life easier. But yeah, there was a lot of early buy-in, especially from, I think we got a lot of credibility and buy-in from the teams themselves inside these functions, because they knew they didn't want to be handed requirements. They didn't want to get these things after 18 months of going back and forth about, give us an estimate for this, give us an estimate for that. And then like 6 months later, we're going to give you the thing when the whole landscape has changed, right? So they were kind of really excited about changing this. And then it was really a question of asking the intake process, how well is this working for you? Right? Like, what's the value that you're getting out of this? And, you know, you press in some cases, you explore with them, and you come to the point where it's like, yeah, we'd rather not be doing this. We'd rather have something that is leaner, that is more productive, that gives us better feedback, that's faster, that allows us to celebrate more than, spin plates and do all this wrangling. So, you eventually, I think, when it comes to flow, when it comes to value delivery, it's in everyone's best interest, right? I mean, that's the wonderful thing about it, is that there's no one in an organization will say, we don't want to make customers' lives better. We don't want to make more money. We don't want, you know, to be more effective or efficient. We don't want to save money. We don't want to work on new things or exciting things. We don't want to be challenged professionally instead of our patients. Like, everybody wants these things, right? So I think it's tapping into those common, you know, common sources of excitement for people. Uh, like, you do have to understand what resonates most for them and kind of go for that. But there's always a way to align the change to someone's personal motivations. I really enjoyed when Steve was saying earlier about, I will butcher it, but essentially personal incentive, right? It's a very, very powerful thing. And so making sure that you're considering that, what's in it for me, and how do you make this in everyone's best interest, is really, really important.